Alright guys, welcome. Here we go again. We've got another video lesson for you, and today we're going to finally get into some of the... Well, we've already talked about causes of the revolution, but now we're going to get into the actual meat and potatoes of what the revolution is and how it happened. We are going to talk about taxation without representation. Now, this lesson is going to be split in a couple of ways. So today we're going to talk mainly, we're going to focus on taxes, we're going to focus on parliament, we're going to focus on the representation itself or the lack thereof, and then we're going to get into a little bit of what the colonists did, and then tomorrow we're going to get way more into what the colonists did, how the colonists reacted, groups like the Sons of Liberty, things like that. So we're going to get more into it tomorrow. Today is mainly setting the stage, telling you more what the British did than anything else. So our objective, we're going to explain how British colonial policies regarding North America led to the Revolutionary War. Same objective for tomorrow. Key terms are all there. The acts, you got to get all the acts, at least the ones here. We're going to talk about more later, but you need these. There's only one more set we're going to talk about later. The big brain question of the day is explain how British policy united the colonies and what the colonists were most upset about in the policy. So what do you think really bothered them the most? Think about that as well, because we're going to get into that. So taxation without representation is the title. Remember the 7 Years' War and its impacts, because a big part of why all this happens is because of the 7 Years' War. So there's our title, right, that we already know. There's our objective. So let's get into it. So where that? There we go. All right. So what the colonists want, and honestly what they kind of already had pre 7 Years' War, pre-French and Indian War. The thing they want the most is a free enterprise system, a free enterprise economy. And what that means is the government doesn't get involved. They're hands off. You can't see me right now, but if you could, my hands would be off. Hands off. The government is not involved in the economy. The people are involved with the economy, and they are in charge. And they do that. The reason they want to do that is because the people being in charge means the people make the profit, not the government, not anybody else. Now, the reason I say that the colonists kind of had this already was because of the relaxed British policies. All right, relaxed British policies allow the colonists to work this way. Now, most of this work, to be fair to the British, is illegal, but they do it anyways through smuggling, through just ignoring the rules, through the British not taxing them, and this was called salutary neglect, hence sweet picture of king with shades on. Salutary neglect is what this was called, and what it means is, again, the British being hands off. Ignoring. Hey, we're not going to do anything, right? Our hands are off because you're making us money. We like making money. That's that. But once that war starts and once there is no more money being made and now the colonists are actually costing something, we're going to step away from that salutary neglect and the British are going to try to enforce all these rules. So let's get into the first key point so we can talk about this. All right, so key point 1 is up right now, and what that is pretty simple. So key point 1. New British efforts to collect taxes without direct colonial representation or consent and to assert imperial authority in the colonies began to unite the colonists against perceived and real constraints on their economic activities and political rights. So the reason it says conceived and real is because some of these were fake. Some of these were people just kind of egging everybody on, but some of them were very real, and their rights were indeed being not taken away, but definitely being ignored. You could argue they were taken away, but they were certainly ignored. And we're going to get into why and all that in a second. So if you need more time on the slide, go ahead and pause like you should have done on the last one. We're going to move forward. So, next thing we're going to talk about, Parliament's role. So, Parliament is the legislature that, along with the king, makes laws and policy in Britain. You should already know that. If you don't know that, write it down. A representative, someone who speaks on your behalf in the legislature. Again, you should know this, but write it down just in case. Parliament practice virtual representation. That's what they called it. It's funny, right? We're digital internet school. Virtual representation in regard to the colonies, which basically means this is what Parliament told to the colonists when they said, hey, don't you think we should be represented? Well, you guys are British citizens, and the British citizens in Parliament are representing you, so you're already represented. You don't need somebody from the colonies over here. We got you. And like you might guess, the colonists didn't really like that. And what are the things that Parliament's going to do post 7 Years' War to the colonies that are going to make them upset? Well, pause here if you need time because we're going to move on. We got a chart for that. Look at that, a chart for that, right? There's a chart for that. Now, These 5 acts are your terms, key terms. They're all key terms. So you can write them in chart form, and that'll count as your key terms. Or if you prefer, and I would say it's probably best to do it in the chart way, but if you prefer, you can just keep them on the side of your page wherever you put your key terms already. If you like cards, you can make cards. If you just keep them on the side, keep them on the side. Or you can make the chart. I would recommend making the chart. But we got the Stamp Act, 1765. We got the Townshend Acts of 1767, which come a little later. We'll get into those a bit. These are out of order, by the way. Sugar Act of 1764, the first thing. The Tea Act of 1773, which again we'll get into. And the Quartering Act of 1765. So we're going to get into all these things, and we're going to kind of talk about the timeline. I'm not going to spend too much time on the timeline now, because like I said, tomorrow when we get into colonial responses and stuff, that's when we'll get really into the timeline. But let me put the info up, so that way you guys can get there already. And now, these are out of order on the chart, but I'm going to talk about them in order, so hopefully it's not too confusing. Right after the conflict, you get the Sugar Act. And what's funny about the Sugar Act that not a lot of people know is that it actually lowers the tax on molasses, right? Molasses is like a syrupy thing you get with sugar when you cook it down and you make it's like a syrup. It's like a thick syrup. And you use it, it's a main ingredient in rum, which is why everybody's so crazy about molasses. Right? They're not baking cookies here, they're making rum with it. But what the Sugar Act does do is it allows the British to crack down on the smugglers that were sneaking in cheaper molasses straight from the Indies, from the West Indies. And it also makes smugglers get trials in British courts instead of American courts. And American courts are famous, or infamous depending on who you are, for trying a smuggler and just letting him go because, hey, guess what? Judges in the Americas like cheap rum just as much as anybody else. So that is what the Sugar Act is going to do. Did that stop the smuggling? No. But they were punished way more harshly for getting caught, which would end up happening now as opposed to before, when the British don't really care about enforcing the Sugar Act. So that's something to keep in mind. Next will come the Stamp Act, and this is going to make it even worse. So this is a tax on all legal documents and papers. Wills. Like, I'm going to die, I need to leave all my stuff to my children or whatever. Newspapers. Diplomas. Almanacs, which are like, little booklets that you read and gain info from. Playing cards. We're going to watch a video at the end of the class. It's like 2 minutes. It's a 2-minute segment of a full video. You can look up the full video later, but it's good stuff. And in there you'll see like how funny and ridiculous this kind of is. Especially how ridiculous it was to the colonists at the time. The colonial response to that's going to be much more organized, much more specific. You're going to see petitions for anything written. You're going to see boycotts of the goods. You're going to see riots in Boston. And you're going to see something called the Stamp Act Congress get created. And the Stamp Act Congress, we'll talk about in a little bit, was one of the first times that the colonists all acted together. On top of the Stamp Act, something called the Quartering Act was done. Side note, what's happening in between is these acts are getting passed, the colonists are getting really mad, and Britain is kind of getting forced through colonial protests and actions to repeal them. And the king's getting more and more frustrated because they're my colonies, I should be able to tax them if I want to. So he also sends troops with the Stamp Act, and he's making the Americans pay for these troops with the Stamp Act. So he's sending troops there, and where are the troops going to stay? Well, it's something called the Quartering Act, where colonists are forced to house British soldiers. To support these soldiers was something that British colonists didn't want to do. So what you're going to see from this point on, and pretty much it's like a British redcoat is going to be resented and disliked by the colonists because they're forced to kind of stay and live there. And we'll talk more about the Quartering Act when it becomes a bigger deal during the Intolerable Acts because it's going to get worse. But that's something to keep in mind. So then, these acts are getting put on and repealed and put on and repealed. Eventually, the Stamp Act is repealed, but then, still needing money, still wanting to make a statement to the colonists, they passed the Townshend Acts, which are taxes on goods like glass, paper, paint, lead, tea, everything. Everything's taxed. And literally, they could search people without cause on the streets, right, without a reason. And what happens there? Well, more protests, more boycotts. You'll get like the Daughters of Liberty out of this thing, which are going to not buy British goods and like sew stuff at home instead It's going to be intense. And then eventually the Townshend Acts are going to be wreaking havoc for a few years, and then those are going to get repealed. All except for one, the Tea Act of 1773, where British merchants could sell tea directly to the public at a cheaper price than the Americans. I shouldn't say than the British. This will lead to the Boston Tea Party. Basically, what you see here with the Tea Act is that it's rules on the availability and the pricing of tea, and the colonists are not happy about this. They don't like the idea that, to them, tea is such a big deal to them. It's like, well, if you can tax tea, you can tax anything. It would be like if the government today put a tax out on YouTube videos and made you pay a quarter for each YouTube video you watch. Each time you loaded up a video, they just charged you a quarter. And it just, got taken out of your card, or, somebody showed up at your door and collected it. But anytime you watch the video, even if you've seen it before, even if it's a short video, even if it's a big video, you just got taxed a quarter. Like, doing that to tea is the equivalent of doing that to YouTube. And it's something that the colonists just will not stand for, and it will lead to the Boston Tea Party, which we will get into more again on Friday. So, next key point. So if you need time on this, which you probably do, go ahead and pause now. We're going to move on to key point 2. So, colonial leaders based their calls for resistance to Britain on arguments about their rights as British subjects, the rights of individual local traditions of self-rule, and ideas of the Enlightenment. So basically, the colonists are saying, look, we've been running ourselves, we've been in charge for the longest time, we've got rules that we've established, right? A lot of the colonies had their own taxes and policies. So they're not happy about that. They'll also point out, we have an English Bill of Rights and you're violating it by not giving us our voice. They have that as well. And on top of that, all of these Lockean ideas, right, from the Enlightenment of like life, liberty, property, and freedom of tyranny, and question your government, are also influencing these leaders. So before we get into exactly what the reactions are and all that, let's talk about types of protest. So, a protest actively speaking out against a law you disagree with, you feel unfair, making your voice heard. Again, these are terms you should have heard already. These are terms you should know already, but just in case you don't, or if you know you don't, it's fine, but get them now so that way you have them. A boycott, refusing to take part in activities you disagree with, refusing to buy them also. Petition, signing a document that shows people that you disagree, All of these things are going to be used by the colonists, and they're going to work to varying degrees. So, if you needed that slide, go back, pause it there. We're going to talk about colonial reactions to these. So, the Stamp Act Congress, colonial response to the Stamp Act. They meet negotiated protests, and for the first time they unified the colonies. If you get anything from the Stamp Act Congress, know that it's the first time that the colonies are ever unified. And part of why that is because when you put a tax on paper, it affects people like newspaper printers and lawyers, which are like the elites. And the elites are going to be affected the most, so the elites are going to move and make the change. It's not like John Farmer or Stephen, shipbuilder that's getting this tax. It's mostly the elites, and they do not like it. They do not like it. So, another thing that was cited or that they reacted by was the natural rights of Englishmen. So, a lot of arguments made against British actions used the English Bill of Rights as support. The English Bill of Rights was developed in 1689, and it establishes basic civil rights to all English citizens, which these colonists are, and they feel like those rights are being violated, and in some ways they were, specifically that representation thing. Now, natural rights of the people, life, liberty, property, John Locke and others having ideas about people's rights. Enlightenment ideas, rights do not come from the government, they come from God, you're born with them. These things alone, right, lead people to question the king and their government and what's coming of that. The Sons of Liberty, a patriot group that organization that coordinates protests and resistance efforts with great success. Sons of Liberty joke right there. We will get more into what they did and how they acted and who they were there, but these are all the Sons of Liberty, and we'll talk more about them a little later on, but just keep them in mind, get them down already, because tomorrow we're going to go full swing. We're going to talk about them. They're a group. One of the biggest things they did is the Boston Tea Party. They were straight up the ones who did that. So that's it for notes today, guys. The exit ticket is going to be in AP Classroom. It is going to be its own assessment called Taxation and Representation. Exit ticket is multiple choice. The timer's set for 8 minutes. Easy peasy. Good stuff. So make sure you go in, get that done. If you're missing it or if it's locked, you need to message me on Teams and let me know. Otherwise, guys, have a great rest of your day. I will see you all again next time in class.